Short Animal 9, the courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes breathing feel like a task. Every seat was filled, yet no one dared to speak. All eyes were fixed on the man sitting at the center of it all, his wheelchair slightly forward, his hands gripping the leash of the dog sitting obediently by his side. The man was a decorated veteran, his crisp uniform displaying a row of shining medals that glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. His face, lined with years of service and sacrifice, was tense but calm. To those who didn't know his story, he looked like any other soldier. But those in the room understood the gravity of this moment. This wasn't just another case, it was something deeply personal. By his side was Thor, a German shepherd with intelligent, watchful eyes. The dog sat perfectly still, his body tense as if sensing the weight of the situation. To most in the room, Thor looked like a typical working dog. But to the soldier, Thor was so much more. Thor wasn't just a partner in the field, he was family. A lifeline. A savior. The soldier's name wasn't important to the strangers in the room, but his story was. He had served multiple tours, risking his life in ways most people couldn't even imagine. And through it all, Thor had been by his side. Thor had pulled him from danger, shielded him from gunfire, and even sniffed out traps and explosives before anyone else noticed them. The two had faced the impossible together, their bond forged in the fires of war. But today, that bond was being tested like never before. The military had decided that Thor, considered government property, was to be reassigned. To them, Thor was just a resource, a tool to be used for the next mission. But to the soldier, losing Thor felt like losing a part of himself. After everything they had been through, after all the sacrifices made, this decision felt like a betrayal. The judge, seated high on the bench, broke the silence. His voice was steady but distant as he reminded the soldier that this was his final chance to speak. The man adjusted his grip on Thor's leash, his knuckles white from the tension. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice raw with emotion but steady enough to carry across the room. "Your Honor," he started, his words heavy, "Thor isn't just a dog. He's not just a military asset. He's my family. On the battlefield, he saved my life more times than I can count. When I was injured and couldn't move, he stayed with me, shielding me from gunfire. He even warned me of traps before I could see them." The soldier's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "And when I came home, when I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror, Thor was there. He gave me a reason to keep going when I didn't have one. Please don't take him away from me." The room remained utterly silent, the air thick with unspoken emotion. Spectators wiped tears from their eyes. Some exchanged glances filled with pity, others with quiet outrage. Even the judge, who was known for his impartial demeanor, looked slightly moved, though he quickly masked it. The soldier's hands trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the leash, glancing down at Thor, who sat still and quiet. The dog's calm presence was a reminder of all they had been through together. But just as the judge leaned forward to deliver his ruling, something unexpected happened. Thor stood abruptly, his ears perking up as his body tensed. His watchful eyes locked onto something invisible to everyone else in the room. Then, he barked a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the courtroom. The sudden noise startled everyone, breaking the heavy silence like glass shattering on the floor. The soldier froze, his heart pounding. He had seen this behavior before. This wasn't random barking or a reaction to the noise. Thor was alerting to something. On the battlefield, This kind of reaction had saved lives. It was Thor's way of signaling danger, of warning that something wasn't right. "What is it, boy?" the soldier whispered, his voice trembling. He followed Thor's gaze, but he couldn't see anything unusual. The dog barked again, this time louder, more insistent. His body leaned forward slightly, his muscles coiled as if preparing to spring into action. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone asked from the back. Thor barked again, his voice sharp and clear, commanding attention. The soldier's grip on the leash tightened, his instincts kicking in. He turned to the judge, his voice louder this time. "He's not just barking," he said, urgency filling his tone. "He only reacts like this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us." The tension in the room shifted, the unease spreading like wildfire. The bailiffs at the front exchanged nervous glances, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. The judge hesitated, his gavel forgotten in his hand as he stared at the dog. Thor let out another sharp bark, then growled a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down everyone's spine. The dog's body was rigid, his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom. Whatever Thor had sensed, it wasn't just about the soldier anymore. It was something much bigger. Something no one in the room could ignore. The soldier leaned forward in his wheelchair, his heart racing. "Thor, what is it?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. But deep down, he already knew. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. And in that moment, the soldier realized that this wasn't just about saying goodbye to his dog. This was about to become something far more dangerous and far more important than anyone could have imagined. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. All eyes were on the soldier as he sat in his wheelchair, his hand gripping the leash of his loyal dog. The judge sat high on the bench, his face expressionless, waiting for the soldier to speak. The quiet in the room felt suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The soldier, dressed in his military uniform, looked down at Thor, the German shepherd sitting calmly by his side. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his grip on the leash. He knew this was his last chance, his final plea to keep the one being who had stood by him through the darkest times of his life. Taking a deep breath, the soldier raised his head and began to speak. His voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. "Your Honor," he said, his words echoing in the silent room, "this isn't just a dog. Thor isn't just a military asset. He's my partner, my protector, and my family." The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The soldier continued, his voice growing raw with emotion. "On the battlefield, Thor saved my life more times than I can count. He pulled me out of danger, shielded me from gunfire, and even warned me of traps before I could see them. He didn't just do his job, he went above and beyond to make sure I came home alive." The room remained completely still, every person hanging on to his every word. The soldier's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on, his gaze fixed on the judge. "But it wasn't just the battlefield," he said. "When I came home, I wasn't the same person. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. I felt broken, like I didn't belong anywhere. But Thor was there. He gave me a reason to wake up every morning, a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me. I've lost enough already." As the soldier finished speaking, the room remained silent. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone. Spectators shifted in their seats, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues, others exchanging glances of sympathy and outrage. A woman in the front row let out a quiet sniffle, and even one of the bailiffs looked away, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. The judge's face was unreadable, but his fingers tapped the desk lightly, a subtle sign that he was affected by what he heard. The soldier reached down, gently stroking Thor's head as he waited for the judge to respond. Thor, ever calm, leaned into the touch, his steady presence a source of comfort for the man who had been through so much. But just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, something unexpected happened. Thor stood up abruptly, his ears perking and his body tensing. His calm demeanor was gone in an instant. His sharp bark echoed through the courtroom, startling everyone. Heads turned, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thor barked again, louder this time, his eyes locked on the doors at the far end of the room. The soldier froze, his heart racing. He knew this behavior all too well. Thor wasn't just barking randomly, he was alerting. This was the same reaction Thor had shown on the battlefield when there was danger nearby. The soldier's grip tightened on the leash, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thor, what is it?" he whispered, though deep down, he already knew something was wrong. The dog barked again, pulling slightly against the leash. His growl was low and steady, vibrating through the room and sending a shiver down the spines of everyone present. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the unease spreading like wildfire. What had started as a formal legal proceeding now felt like something far more dangerous. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back of the room. Another person stood slightly, their eyes darting nervously toward the doors. Thor's growling intensified, his body rigid and his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors. The soldier's breathing quickened as he wheeled himself forward slightly, his voice breaking the growing murmurs in the crowd. "He's not just barking," he said, his tone urgent. "He only acts like this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us." The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of the soldier's words sinking in. Even the bailiffs, who had been standing calmly by the judge's bench, exchanged nervous glances. One of them moved toward the doors, his hand resting on the weapon at his side, his step slow and deliberate. Thor barked again, louder and sharper, as if urging everyone to act faster. The soldier clenched the leash tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His instincts screamed at him that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. All he could do was trust Thor just as he always had. The judge, visibly unsettled, gripped his gavel but didn't use it. His voice, usually commanding, was hesitant as he asked, "What's going on here?" but no one had an answer. The only sound in the room was Thor's growling, deep and menacing, echoing off the courtroom walls. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was, Thor was determined to make them all see it. Thor's barking grew louder, sharp and commanding, echoing through the courtroom. His body was tense, his ears pinned back, and his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. His normally calm demeanor had vanished, replaced with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The soldier's heart raced as he tightened his grip on the leash. He had seen this behavior before, too many times to count. Thor was trained to alert to danger, hidden explosives, traps, even unseen enemies. And every time, Thor had been right. The soldier leaned forward slightly, his voice low but urgent. "Thor, what is it, boy?" he whispered, though he already knew. This wasn't a random reaction. Thor never behaved this way unless there was real danger nearby. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward the doors Thor was fixated on. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered. Another voice followed, "Is it safe in here?" Fear was beginning to ripple through the crowd. Thor let out another sharp bark, pulling slightly against his leash. His growls were deep and menacing, vibrating through the tense air. The soldier looked at the judge, his voice firm despite the unease in his chest. "Your Honor," he said, "Thor doesn't react like this without a reason. He's trained to sense danger. Something isn't right." The judge froze, his gavel halfway to the desk. His expression, once stern and controlled, now showed signs of doubt. He exchanged a glance with the bailiff standing near the bench. "Check the hallway," he said, his voice steady but edged with nervousness. The bailiffs hesitated for a moment, then nodded and moved toward the doors. Thor's barking grew more frantic as the bailiffs approached the doors. The larger of the two reached for the handle, his other hand resting on the weapon at his hip. The room held its breath as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. At first, it seemed empty, nothing but shadows stretching across the polished floor. But Thor's growling didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Then, from the darkness, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. The bailiffs froze, their eyes widening as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hooded coat that obscured most of his face. He walked with an unsettling confidence, his movements slow and deliberate as if he had no fear of the room full of people now staring at him. Thor's barking became relentless, his body straining against the leash. The soldier struggled to hold him back, his voice breaking as he called out, "Thor, stay." But the dog didn't stop. His focus was locked on the stranger, his growls deepening into something almost primal. The stranger stepped into the light, his face partially visible under the hood. His sharp, cold eyes scanned the room before settling on Thor. A faint smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. He seemed completely unfazed by the chaos he'd caused. The larger bailiff raised his hand, his voice stern. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Thor. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low and calm but chillingly confident. "I'm here for the dog," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. People exchanged bewildered and frightened glances, their whispers growing louder. The soldier's jaw tightened, his grip on Thor's leash firm. His voice cut through the murmurs, strong and defiant. "He's not just a dog," he said, glaring at the stranger. "He's my partner. My family. You'll have to go through me to take him." The stranger's smirk widened slightly, though his eyes remained cold. "I'm afraid it's not up to you," he said. "The dog belongs to us. You know that. He's not meant to stay with you." The soldier's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained firm. He moved his wheelchair slightly forward, placing himself between Thor and the stranger. "He doesn't belong to anyone but me," he said, his voice unwavering. "Whatever you think you're entitled to, you're wrong. Thor isn't going anywhere." The tension in the room was unbearable. Thor barked again, his sharp voice cutting through the heavy silence. His growling grew louder as the stranger took a small step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The bailiffs reached for their weapons, their hands trembling slightly. "Stay back," the larger bailiff warned, his voice tight. The stranger paused, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of mock surrender. "Relax," he said smoothly. "No one needs to get hurt. Just hand over the dog, and I'll leave." The soldier shook his head, his eyes blazing with determination. "Over my dead body," he said firmly. For a moment, the stranger's calm demeanor faltered. His eyes narrowed, his smirk fading. He took a step back, his gaze flickering between the soldier and Thor. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We'll be back." Without another word, the stranger turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Thor's growling softened, but his body remained tense, his gaze fixed on the doors. The soldier let out a shaky breath, his grip still tight on the leash. Whatever had just happened, one thing was clear: this was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The stranger stood tall and calm, his hood casting shadows over his sharp, cold eyes. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression that was harder to read: calculated, almost amused. Thor continued growling, his body tense and ready to spring. The soldier sat in his wheelchair, gripping Thor's leash tightly, his heart pounding as he stared down the man who had disrupted everything. "You don't understand," the stranger said, his voice low and deliberate. "This dog isn't just an animal. He's special. He's more than you think he is. And he doesn't belong here. He belongs with us." The soldier's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, his voice steady and strong. "Thor doesn't belong to anyone but me," he said firmly. "He's my partner, my family. Whatever you think you know about him, it doesn't matter. You're not taking him." The stranger's eyes flickered with something: frustration, maybe even anger, but he quickly masked it. "You're making a mistake," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Do you really think you can protect him? Do you even know what he is capable of?" The soldier's grip on Thor's leash tightened. "I know exactly what he is capable of," he said. "I've seen him save lives, including mine. He is not just a tool for you to use. He is a hero. And if you think I'm going to let you take him, you're wrong." The room was silent except for Thor's growling, low and menacing, vibrating through the air like a warning. The judge, who had been watching the exchange with wide, nervous eyes, finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "This is a court of law," he said, trying to assert some control. "You can't just walk in here and make demands." The stranger turned his gaze to the judge, his smirk returning. "This isn't about your laws," he said, his tone almost mocking. "This is bigger than that. You don't know what's at stake." "Then tell us," the soldier demanded, his voice rising. "If this is so important, tell us why. Why are you so determined to take him?" The stranger's smirk faded again, replaced by a cryptic expression. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You wouldn't understand," he said simply. "But you'll see soon enough." The bailiffs moved closer, their hands on their weapons, ready to intervene. The larger one took a step forward, his voice commanding. "You need to leave now," he said. "We're not asking." The stranger glanced at the bailiffs, his calm demeanor never wavering. For a moment, it seemed like he might resist, but then he stepped back, raising his hand slightly in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone smooth but chilling. "I'll leave, for now." Thor barked sharply, pulling against the leash as if warning the stranger not to come any closer. The man's eyes lingered on Thor, his smirk returning as he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a weight that sent chills through the room. "You can't protect him forever." Without another word, the stranger turned and walked toward the doors, his steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the tension he'd left behind. The two figures who had followed him into the courtroom disappeared into the shadows with him. The heavy wooden doors creaked shut behind them, and the room was left in stunned silence. The soldier let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he loosened his grip on Thor's leash. Thor, still tense, sat down next to him, his growls finally subsiding. The soldier reached down, running a hand gently over Thor's head. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice heavy with relief and exhaustion. "You did good." Around the room, people began to move again, the tension slowly dissipating. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "This court is adjourned," he said quickly, slamming his gavel. He rose from his seat and left without another word. As the spectators filed out, their whispers filled the room. "Who was that man?" one asked. "What did he want with the dog?" murmured another. But no one had answers, only fear and confusion. The soldier stayed behind, his hand resting on Thor's head. He glanced toward the doors where the stranger had disappeared, his mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What did he know about Thor, and why did he seem so certain that this wasn't the end? Thor leaned against the soldier's leg, his calm presence grounding him in the moment. Whatever the stranger's intentions were, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. But for now, they had each other. And no matter what came next, they would face it together.